So the last seminar for the weekend is the Vietnam Air War. And we have three speakers today. Spook Johns, who flew early with the Navy, flying a Skyraider. Chuck DeBellevue, who flew an F-4 Phantom. He flew late in the war. And then we have John Zimitsch, who didn't fly in the war, but who served as a navigator on a B-52, and he's going to cover the heavy bomber aspects of the Vietnam War and can talk about the characteristics of the plane and the types of missions flown and that sort of thing. So we'll start out with just a little bit of an introduction of why each of our veteran speakers decided to join the military and why they wanted to fly. So Spook, we'll start with you. Okay, keep the mic close. That's it, okay. You have to stretch your neck, so. Go. Okay, why did you join the military and why did you want to fly and when?
Well, first of all, back in my era, when you were committed to going in the military, at least 2 years in the Army, or if you chose to fly, then the Navy and the Air Force was requiring you to stay a little longer. I'm one of these kids who built model airplanes all my life, and I always loved the Navy airplanes. My father was a ship captain on the Great Lakes, and he wouldn't tolerate me flying with the Air Force. If I was going to fly, I had to do it off of a ship.
And what year did you join the Navy?
1960.
1960, okay. And Chuck DeBellevue, when did you join? Why did you join the Air Force? And why did you want to fly?
I always wanted to fly. I enjoyed it. I started out in Civil Air Patrol, working on rescue missions in Louisiana, and that got my interest a lot. And like Spook, we had a draft on, so if you didn't want to join the Air Force, the Army wanted you. And not that the Army's not a bad way to go, because my dad was in the Army, but I wanted to fly, and so I ended up going to college, taking ROTC, and graduated with a commission. And got into the Air Force in January of '68. And of course, the Vietnam War was going hot and heavy, and I didn't go over right away. I ended up going over in '71. And okay.
And did either of you have a choice about what you were going to fly?
In the Navy, it was dependent, A, on your flight grades, B, the needs of the Navy, and C, your desires. And I had good grades, and I initially was intrigued by flying the A3J North American Vigilante, but when I did get into the training command and I found that there were still Skyraiders flying in the Navy, I thought, man, I'm never going to get a chance to fly something like this again. So I put in for it, and I was glad I did. I've been happy with that for the last 50 years. Ideas I ever had.
The Air Force is similar. You know, it's basically how your grades are, what airplanes came down, and what your desires were. And I started out in the back seat of the F-4, and I had a choice of airplanes that I could have gone to, but I wanted to go to the fighter. And when I came out of Southeast Asia, I went to pilot training, and the same thing, same rules applied. If you were number one in the class, you got your choice of what came down. If you were number last in the class, you got your choice of what was left.
Okay, John Zimitsch, why did you want to join the Air Force? And or join the military, let's say. You can specify the Air Force. And when did you join, and why did you want to fly?
My story is a little bit different. I grew up, well, and you see the veterans running around here, river rats. I see we got one right out here front. And the other Vietnam veterans over in the tent over here. I grew up watching that war as a youth, going through grade school, high school, and it really wasn't a popular thing. So I didn't come out of high school all eager to go into the military, but I was always working on, I loved, like Spook over there, I loved working on model airplanes. My focus was primarily World War II, but I loved Phantoms and 105s. I really liked building those. And so as I got into college, I had my hobbies. One of them was aviation, military aviation, attending air shows like this, taking photographs. And I started reading books, and Chuck there became a personal hero of mine. As I was still in high school, being an ace in Vietnam, how much better can it get than that? And flying an F4, which was my favorite airplane at the time. And so I decided to join ROTC, went to the College of St. Thomas at the time. It's now University of St. Thomas. But, and all through ROTC, Chuck continued to be my hero, personal hero. I was looking at him. I had a Navigator slot. I knew Chuck was a Navigator. And I thought, okay, yeah, I can follow that track. I don't know if I necessarily want to get shot at, but I could follow that track. And so that's really what led me in. I was commissioned out at St. Thomas in 1982.
Spook, where did you receive your training, and how long did your training last? Just very briefly.
Yeah, I started in Pensacola in September of 1960. And first you went through 4 months of pre-flight. By the way, I had gotten my degree at Michigan State University, so after 4 months you got your commission as an officer, an ensign in the Navy. Whereas if you only had 2 years of college, they had what they call a NAVCAD program, Naval Aviation Cadet, and you didn't get your commission until you got your wings, which is somewhere around 18 months. After commissioning from pre-flight, we went to Softly Field, and we put in about 30 hours in a T-34 trainer just to see if you liked flying, basically, because there's a lot of guys, they call it DOR, meant drop on request. They just figured flying wasn't for them. On the other hand, if you showed any skills at all, they would, those guys went on. And then after the 30 hours, we went up to Whiting Field, where you checked out in a T-28 Bravo, which was a neat airplane. It had 1,425 horsepower, and it was, much of its performance characteristics were pretty much like World War II airplanes. And it was a neat airplane to fly. We learned to solo it and then do aerobatics, et cetera, and then we learned how to fly the airplane basic instruments. We would sit in the back seat, and the instructor would be in the front seat, and they put what we call the canvas sky over you, and you couldn't see out, so you had to learn how to fly instruments. When we completed that, we went to South Whiting Field, another just part of a big area of airports. And we learned how to navigate on radio instruments, and after that was done, then we went into formation flying. And that really was my thing. I just love flying formation, and it inspired me to keep it up rather than going to multi-engine or some of that jazz. And when we finally finished that, we had a few hops, I think, as I recall, there were 6 hops. with aerial gunnery, where one T-28 would tow a banner, and we would make passes at it. And the last one, we'd had real ammunition, and everybody got to shoot at a banner. Well, and then you were basically finished with Whiting Field, and we went back to Softley Field, and there we went into training to make our first aircraft carrier landings. And I looked at my logbook not too long ago, and I think we practiced making 80-some carrier landings on an airport outside of Pensacola at Barron Field. They called it Bloody Barron from its reputation in World War II. But we didn't have those problems. And one of the great events in your life, trust me, is when you make your first carrier landings. And you go out to the carrier with 4 airplanes, and each one of us, this, by the way, is after they'd gotten the angled carrier deck in the Navy. So this is the carrier Antietam, it was a World War II carrier, but they modified it with the angled deck. And so you'd make 2 touch and goes, or they call them bolters, but you wouldn't put the hook down, you just banged on the deck and took off again, came around, did it again. If those were satisfactory to the LSO, which stood for Landing Signal Officer, he would signal you to put your hook down, and then you trapped on your next landing, raise the hook, and then they just spin up the engine and you go around and come around. You did that 6 times, and then you were a genuine carrier qual naval aviator. The only thing you had to do then is go to the officers club and fill up a shot glass with brandy and light it on fire and bang it down and see if you could do it without burning all the air out of your nose. A little bit later down the line. We'll get to that, but I'll pass on that. That's what we'll get into advanced training. Back to you, sir.
Okay, Chuck DeBellevue, just real briefly, where was your training and how long did it last? The initial training.
I started off at Mather Air Force Base for nav training and graduated from there, went down to Davis-Monthan for F4 training and got qualified in the airplane and went to an operational assignment prior to going to Southeast Asia.
Okay, and John Zimitsch, what about your training? Where was it and how long did it last?
Okay, my training, like Chuck's nav school, was at Mather Air Force Base out in California in Sacramento. Went there. It's about a 9-month program when I went through. And coming out of there, well, a little bit before that, while I was at St. Thomas, I discovered something other than airplanes. It was a cute little ROTC cadet there, and ended up marrying her. So we got commissioned in 1982. It was a busy year. Got commissioned, graduated from college, got commissioned, and got married all in 2 weeks. And then 6 months later, I went to Mather in December. And the following January, she went to Biloxi, Mississippi, Keesler Air Force Base for communications training. So going in nav school, I actually did very well in nav training. Like I said, the F4 was my favorite airplane. But now I also wanted a joint spouse assignment with my wife. So I had to make a little bit of a sacrifice there, and that's when I got the B-52, which actually worked out very well for me. What an aircraft, and it's still flying. It's going to fly till the year 2040. So I didn't pick a very bad aircraft as far as what I'm going to follow up with. So I went from Mather then down to Castle Air Force Base for the aircraft training. And I was trained on the older version of the aircraft. At that time they were putting GPS units in the B-52. I was going to the older unit which had the same navigation system that the B-52 had when it was originally designed and flew in the Vietnam War. I was training on G models, and I was going to follow on to Barksdale in the G model as well.
Now we're going to just concentrate by era in Vietnam. So we'll start out with Spook Johns. He was there very early on. And so, can you talk about your first tour? You were there before, you were in the Gulf of Tonkin before the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And just very briefly talk about that tour, what was going on, what kind of missions you were flying.
Okay, if it's okay, that I start off actually talking about my cruise, my initial cruise in Westpac on the Constellation. It was a brand new carrier, and the thrust of naval aviation in those days was nuclear delivery. And we all were assigned targets that were deemed important. For instance, so my first target was the Russian submarine base in Vladivostok, Russia. And I was to drop a nuclear bomb on that from a Skyraider. And then we'd go into a port and have in a way, a vacation in many respects. But they were just showing off the ability of the Navy to engage in World War III. So anyway, the next cruise, we went back to the States for about 9 months, and we got some new pilots, and we retrained and got qualified day and night carrier landings. And the gentleman asked about the night carrier landings. Generally speaking, the Navy just had air carriers available down by San Diego. We'd go out what's called a P-patch at night and practice night carrier landings. But the weather was so bad, they decided to go over to Hawaii. You can do that if you had your own carrier, and we just went over to Hawaii and practiced night carrier landing, get qualified for that. And that, the Navy has a motto that once you've made your first night carrier landing, the rest of life is all downhill, and it's a pretty exciting moment in your life. Then, next time we went to sea, over to Vietnam.
What year is this now? Where?
This was in, let me see, I gotta say, May of 1964. And there was some commotion in Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and there was kind of like what's going on today in the Mideast. But the Navy wasn't involved. We went over there and just patrolled around the South China Sea. And for 55 days we were out at sea. And we went into Hong Kong. And it turns out that on the 2nd of August, the Gulf of Tonkin episode of Navy history started, when these torpedo boats attacked the Turner Joy, and we were called out of Hong Kong and raided Lok Chow and Long Bin, I guess it was, on the 4th of August of 1964. And that kind of made the Vietnamese War an international war rather than a civil war that it really was. I'm going to think of something there, but anyway, you're right.
At this point now, so things were starting.
Yeah.
And so after this, what kind of missions were you flying? How often were you flying? What kind of missions were you flying, and how often did you go up and fly?
Well, what happened? The maps that the Navy had, I don't know about the Air Force, but a lot of these maps were based, basically, understanding that when France, it was French Indochina, so they weren't very accurate, and the Navy and the Air Force were sending their photo reconnaissance planes to do their thing and map the areas, but there was no, they weren't being shot at, but we would launch ADs and for the purpose of assuming they did get shot at and were shot down, we could provide rescue ability to cover helicopters that were going and catch these guys. So the flights that didn't involve something like that were pretty long and pretty boring, to tell you the truth, but they were considered combat missions. I don't know why.
Okay, now, was this your last tour into Vietnam?
No. Towards the end of this cruise that I was just talking about, it so happens that a F-100 was escorting an RF-101 which is a photo recon airplane. And it got shot down by the Navigator Pass, which is where the Ho Chi Minh Trail came down from North Vietnam. And myself and another Lieutenant JG had just been launched off the carrier, and we had 4 Lao 3 rocket pods. Each had 19 2.75 rockets. And they said, join up and go to this point where the Ho Chi Minh Trail was, and there was a F-100 pilot was shot down. And it took us a couple hours to get up that way. And we finally got up there, and there was a big radar site, and with 4 anti-aircraft on its perimeter. And like morons, we did the dumbest thing we started a shootout with these guys. And we knocked off most of these guns. But on my last run, I was down to
Must have been near an airport.
On my last run, I was out of rockets, so we had 4 20mm cannon on the airplane, and I was going to shoot it out with this AA sight. Well, he had the same idea, and he was shooting at me, and a big orange golf ball came at me. I ducked my head, and ultimately we went over to Udorn to get more fuel. And as Air Force airman came over, he said, you know you have a hole in your prop. And there it was, a 37mm hole in the prop. The AD had a Aero Products prop which was hollow, and if it was just a regular standard prop, I would have been dead, and it would have shattered. But, so anyway, that was the only real combat I had during that cruise. Then we came back to the States again.
And then you returned to Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, we went through another training cycle, and but I was scheduled to get out of the Navy a couple months before the squadron was going back there. And I remember one day where I was in a flight of 4 warming up our engines and going on a training hop, bombing up in a target area in the coast range. And I thought, geez, I'd hate to miss all this excitement that these guys are going to be participating in. So I went and talked to our skipper and said, would it be okay if I went on this cruise? And he said, yeah, you're welcome. So that's how I went back to Vietnam.
And how were the missions different on this tour, or were they the same? And how had enemy anti-aircraft fire changed, if it had changed?
Well, it changed a lot because they were always shooting the edge of the end, and we had a lot of variable missions. We had one deal where we'd fly up to the north in the Gulf and rendezvous with an Air Force HU-16, which is a Grumman Albatross. It's a amphibious airplane, and we'd be loaded up with even more rocket pods. We'd have 6 of these 19 2.75 rocket pods. And the idea, since we could stay up there a long time, it was an 8-hour mission, and we just drone around. It was boring. On the other hand, if somebody got shot down, it would be just about as exciting as you wanted it to be. We'd have to provide cover for this Albatross, or if helicopters, if the guy was somewhere inside the coastline. On the other hand, we'd have armed directing missions where you'd just be launched and it was up to you to find targets. So you could do that in North Vietnam or the Laos. If you were bombing down south, you checked in with a FAC, a forward air controller, in a light plane, and he knew the territory around his base, so he would point out your targets for you. And then we flew around the clock basically, and because a lot of the senior officers weren't all that crazy about flying at night and coming back on the carrier. That was my reward. I got to do a lot of that. We usually go up in the Laos and look for targets on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We'd carry parachute flares that would light up the area. And it was frustrating because it was really tough to find suitable targets up there. So we figured, what the hell, we just drop bombs on the trail and let them fill in the holes, you know, take them out of action anyway.
Now, if you want to see a visualization of some of his missions, there's a movie that came out a few years ago named Raider Dawn. It's the story of one of his squadron mates, Dieter Dengler, and he was shot down in Laos and was captured and then escaped. And Spook is portrayed in that movie, so see that and see at least a Hollywood version of Spook. Do you recommend the movie?
Well, I recommend seeing the action that Dieter was involved in, because there's no disputing that he was beat up, and he was when he was recovered or rescued, he weighed 90 pounds. He was about a 165-pound man when he was captured. They escaped from their pen in Laos. There were 6 guys. 4 of them were Orientals, primarily Thailanders. They were flying for Air America, or working for them. They weren't the pilots. And another American Air Force helicopter pilot was there also. And Dieter realized that if they didn't make an attempt to escape, they were going to die, because they're just going to starve to death. So they escaped successfully. And Dieter and this Air Force guy were roaming around the jungle for a month or so, basically lost, just like we would be in a forest here in this country. And they came upon a little village, and one of the citizens of this village stepped out from behind a tree with a machete and whacked this other pilot in the thigh, crumpled him, hit him again, whacked him in the neck, and almost severed his head. And Dieter ran like hell and somehow was able to escape that. Then he was by himself roaming around the jungle, and he was adamant in trying to nourish himself. He would eat anything that was available, bugs and reptiles and anything. Sorry, how's that? Okay? Okay. And one of the memorable things that they even tried to portray it in the movie, he was wading across a river and he noticed a snake. Pretty good sized snake that was coiled up in a little area in the river, and he grabbed it by the head and grabbed it by the tail and bit it in half. And he ate half of it right there. And he put the rest of it in his flight suit for his next 5-star meal. And a couple of days ago, later, he was on this same river, I guess, and he gotten a couple of the canopies from parachute flares that we carried, probably. And he made 2 S's, and then he stood in the middle of them and was trying to wave down an airplane. Well, it turns out an Air Force A-1E pilot came flying over, and he saw this guy down on the ground waving at him, and that was certainly unusual. And Dieter didn't look like, just sparkled out of the ready room with a beard and et cetera, et cetera. So they came back and tried to pick him up, and they sent a helicopter to lower the rope. They jumped in and pulled him up in the helicopter. The crew chief grabbed his flight suit and opened it up to see if this guy was an American, a white man. Well, the snake fell out. His crew chief just about jumped out of the helicopter. They brought him back to Da Nang, and they sent a message to the fleet that they've rescued this Lieutenant J.G. Dieter Dengler, And the admiral saw that, he said, that's our guy, go get him. And they sent a cod to the ship, or out to Da Nang, and they, with a flight surgeon who checked him out. As I say, he only weighed 90 pounds, but he was healthy enough to be absconded with. And this doctor just threw a sheet over him and walked out the door of the hospital. They kidnapped him and brought him back to the ship, and it was a great deal.
Chuck DeBellevue, you flew late in the war. Spook Johns flew very early in the war, and he flew out of the Gulf of Tonkin. You came in from Thailand, and you flew an F-4 Phantom. Can you talk about the flight characteristics of an F-4, its capabilities, combat capabilities?
Well, the F-4 initially was a Navy jet. The Navy did a pretty good job. They wanted a fleet interceptor, and it did that well. The Air Force didn't want a fleet interceptor. They wanted something that carried bombs and could dogfight, and did that very well too. The airplane was a heavy airplane. It was highly capable. Its max speed was 2.5 Mach, about 1,800 miles an hour at 50,000 feet. On the deck, I've been 1,000 miles an hour, a little bit higher than this 10 is. So it was a very capable airplane. If you could load it on the airplane, it'd take off. I got over there to Udon the last day of November 1971. By the end of December 71, I'd flown 28 combat missions, 7 of them in North Vietnam, and we weren't going to North Vietnam at that time, and was a qualified instructor.
And you were a navigator at this time. Can you talk about the roles of the pilot versus the navigator, and how you worked together, and what each of you had to do, what your responsibilities were in the airplane?
Well, the F-4 was a twin-engine, two-seat airplane, and although there were 2 individuals in the airplane, if they didn't operate as one, it didn't fly very well. Of course, the pilot flies the jet, he fires some of the missiles, fires the gun, drops bombs. The back seater can also drop bombs. I could also fire some of the missiles. I would navigate the airplane, tell everybody where to go, control the formation, and keep track of what was happening on the ground, and make sure that we got back to base safely. The F-4 was not an economy model. It burned gas like it was going out of style, especially if you were high speed, low altitude. And if you got in a dogfight, one of the main gauges in the airplane was the fuel gauge. Because when it read 0, they got a kill. So you had to watch your gas pretty closely.
You talked about flying 1,000 miles an hour. And when trains started, they thought that trains could go 30 miles an hour, but no one could ride in them because they'd be asphyxiated from the speed. Well, now you're going 1,000 miles an hour, and often at a relatively low altitude. How does your brain work that fast? How do you deal with that? Was it just training? Was it experience? How do you compensate for the speed?
Well, your mind speeds up. I initially started out as a high-speed forward air controller. I was looking for targets in North Vietnam. We usually cruised through the McGee and Ban Cry passes where the Ho Chi Minh Trail came from North Vietnam into Laos at 625 knots calibrated, probably about 725 to 750 miles an hour. The first day you do that, and you're about 300 to 500 feet. The first day you do that, everything's a blur. The second day, not so much. The third day, you can see trucks there, supplies there, people there, and you keep track of all that, and pretty soon you're putting strikers in to take out the trucks and the supplies and the people. Our mission was to interdict the supplies coming into the south and the north. So when I got into air-to-air, which was a lot higher and a lot faster in a lot of cases, and more maneuvering around, it was easy. Your brain was already up to speed.
And what kind of anti-aircraft fighter, what kind of anti-aircraft fighter did you encounter?
In the south, we encountered southern part of North Vietnam. We would encounter 23 millimeter and 37 millimeter. And further north, we get into 57 millimeter and 85 millimeter. 57 is about like that for a slug, 85 is bigger than that. 23 millimeter, when they shoot at you, and you see the tracers, every fifth round is a tracer round, it looks like you've got a water hose. Remember when you were a kid, you'd run a water hose around the yard, and that's what it looked like, just a steady stream. They also fired SA-2 missiles at us, which is a Mach 2 missile. And if you couldn't see it, it was deadly. Once you got used to it, you could look at it. If it was moving on your canopy, it was Spook's airplane they were after, not mine. If it was not moving on my canopy, it was my jet. I had to do something with it. And you'd have to go through a maneuver to make it issue. You couldn't get hyper about it. You had to be very controlled, very methodical, and very definite in your maneuvers. Indecision would kill people, so you had to be very fast at what you're doing.
On a typical mission, if there was such a thing, we think about World War II, maybe there'd be 6, 8, 9 planes out at a time. Was it you and your wingman? How many planes would usually go out, or did it vary all the time depending on the mission?
We normally flew as a 4-ship. On the big missions, big bombing missions into North Vietnam during linebacker, which were the strikes, when Nixon put us back into North Vietnam, the linebacker strikes were there to interdict and destroy targets in North Vietnam. We would take off in a 4-ship, but we were part of a big package that had about 125 airplanes in it. We would take off from the base, fully loaded with missiles and gas, and immediately go to the tanker. The tankers were lined up in cells of 5 in different tracks: green anchor, red anchor, yellow anchor. All of these tracks had 5 tankers in them. You get on your tanker. As soon as all 5 tankers had airplanes on them, the lead tanker would head north and drop us off in Laos at the northern anchor. So when we dropped off the tankers heading into North Vietnam, we were full of gas. And that gave us enough gas to run in country. As soon as the centerline tank on the F4, it was a 600-gallon tank, as soon as it went dry, we kicked that off the airplane, and then we set up, and we would cruise in the area of about 500 knots. Maybe 600 miles an hour. That gave us enough speed to be maneuverable, but not too much to have a wide turning circle, turning radius. As soon as we got engaged with the MiG, we dropped the wing tanks, and the fight was on.
Before we get into air-to-air combat, because not many people ever do this, just talk a little bit about aerial refueling. I mean, it seems like an awfully hair-raising procedure.
Well, you're flying your airplane in close proximity to this great big airplane full of gas, and you're doing about 450 miles an hour, and you get on the tanker, and you fly in formation with it. And then the receptacle for the F4 was right behind the back canopy. The boomer would put the refueling boom into the receptacle, and then you had to keep the airplane pretty steady to make sure that the connection was kept up to keep fuel going into the jet. And the airplane, the tanker told you when you were getting a little too close, a little too far away, a little too high, a little too low. So you had to constantly fly the formation with the tanker. And as the F4 took on more and more gas, it got heavier and heavier, so you had to change it. Nothing was steady. You kept making changes the whole time.
Did it ever get routine?
Well, it got easier.
Yeah, okay.
The first time you do it, you got a death grip on the stick. And after you get comfortable, you fly it with your fingertips.
Okay. At the speeds you're going, talk about aerial navigation a little bit. How do you keep track of what you're doing, where you are, and what tools do you have inside the aircraft? This is days before GPS.
Yeah, we didn't have GPS. I had an inertial navigation system, and we could plug in a coordinate in there, and then I could get readings off that coordinate. We always used we called it bullseye. We put coordinates for Hanoi in the system, so then we knew where we were around Hanoi. And the guys that were directing us also had the same center point, so we got bearing and distance off of Hanoi, so that's how we navigated. I had a map. The map had azimuth lines on it, and then every 10 nautical miles had a circle around it, so I could tell exactly where people were just by looking at, knowing that he was 090 for 30 off of Hanoi. I knew exactly where I was and where he was. We could navigate that way.
Now, coming in on a big mission, did the sky get crowded? And how did you avoid other aircraft? Or wasn't that an issue?
Well, on the big missions, all the guys carrying bombs had their targets to go to. Every one of them that had every bombing airplane had an air-to-air airplane that was tied to him. So the fighters that were assigned to that flight, the bombers, went with them to the target areas. We, on the other hand, were cleared to sweep the area ahead of time, either ahead of time to make sure nobody's in the area, or during the strikes to make sure nobody got in. But we swept ahead of everybody. We were not tied to anything. So where we were, there were no friendlies. So almost anybody we saw was guaranteed to be an enemy. Plus I had a system on my airplane that allowed me to tell whether you were friendly or not.
And you did find enemy aircraft.
We did.
And can you talk about some of your air-to-air engagements? Now, most of us have Hollywood images, and it's hard to get past those. You know, you got your flight goggles on and the silk scarf blowing behind you in the airplane.
Oh, you wanted that guy to show up?
Yeah, or Tom Cruise and Top Gun, something a little more updated.
Yeah.
But what was your reality in Vietnam in an F-4?
Well, let me set up the first briefing for you. Nobody had ever gone to North Vietnam. Nobody had ever been to Hanoi in the room. It was 4:30 in the morning. We were half asleep. We had two intel officers that would always brief us, and they were dead serious. They used to joke with us in the morning. They were dead serious. The briefing boards had a curtain over it, so nobody knew. Finally, the wing commander walked in and sat down. They pulled the curtain away from the board and said, "Gentlemen," because in those days we just had guys flying for us. Said, "Gentlemen, your target for today is downtown," and pointed to Hanoi. It got so quiet in the room you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. At the end of the briefing, Colonel Gabriel, the wing commander, stood up and says, "Guys, we've been waiting for this for a long time. Let's do a good job. Take a look at the guy sitting next to you." So you and your buddy are looking at each other. Then he says, "He may not be coming home." And you go, "Gee, that's too bad. Can I have your stereo here?" We didn't lose anybody that day. Did wonders for our morale. We lost half the squadron later on. I got a lot of buddies that were in the Hanoi Hilton, or worse, didn't make it in. Combat mission, an air-to-air combat mission usually started out with an early morning brief, hitting the tanker. Once you drop off the tanker, everything gets real serious to that point, and it's for real. Your adrenaline would really pump up on takeoff, because if you don't get the beast airborne, you're not going. You get on the tanker, you calm down. You drop off the tanker, get the airplane configured correctly, get everything set up. Because if you don't have it set up correctly before you go in, it'll never get done. And once you get closer to the targets, your adrenaline starts pumping again, and it's an ultimate high. Time has no meaning. Things are running so fast, you don't realize time. Somebody asked me, how much time did I spend looking inside the cockpit? Because I was a lot of inside the cockpit. I said about 85% of my time inside the cockpit. He said, "How much time do you spend outside the cockpit?" About 85% of the time. You're doing everything all the time. And you're reacting to things. You get into the target area, you pick up a MiG, and you're totally focused on getting that MiG on the radar to make sure you're getting the intercept and to make sure the missiles are reacting right. And it's a very high-speed, high-turning fight. We met two guys on the 8th of July. For about 4 minutes, we knew they were in our area, but we didn't see them. Finally, we were always turning. For some reason, I had a premonition that they were ahead of us. And just to the left of the nose was a black fly speck on a white cloud. Didn't belong there. Called it out. I was flying with Steve Ritchie, the first Air Force ace of the war. His signal to the wingman that we were going to fight was when he blew the wing tanks off the airplane, went to full afterburner, and jumped out in front of everybody. There was no radio call. We turned to line up with the MiG, and very shortly after that, we had a brand new shiny MiG-21 going opposite direction to us. As he passed us, well, we had set the wings. The F-4 is not an F-16. It's not a 9G airplane. It's an 8.5G airplane, if you look at the book. Or it's a 10G airplane if you need 10. We set the wings, you roll the airplane over and it's back to 135 degrees, and you can be going 500 knots in one direction, put the stick in your lap, and you come out of that turn 500 knots the opposite direction. It's a very violent maneuver. It takes 17 seconds. So we set the wings, because we expected the guy to turn into us, so instead of, and we were going to go around to get him. He turned away from us. Very unusual. But I had read the Soviet tactics manual, because that's what they were using, Soviet tactics. And this was the bait. And we knew that. So we didn't do anything right then. We waited a few seconds, and here comes the second guy. Comes right by us and turns away from us. He was the shooter. But since we didn't react to the first guy, things didn't work out just exactly right. So both of them have now turned away from us. So instead of having to go around the circle to get to him, we're now opposite each other, and now we cut the circle. We ended up 6,000 feet in trail with the trailing guy. We were firing using an analog radar with an analog missile. The radar had to have 2 seconds once you've locked onto the target to settle down and have good data. The missile then needed another 2 seconds to have good data. If you fired the missile at 3.5 seconds from lock, from when you acquired the target, you had a ballistic missile. It wouldn't guide. So you had to be certain that you allowed enough time for the missile to program. And what you heard from the back seat, because I was monitoring everything, was you're locked 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, and I screamed 1,000 fire. And nothing else out of the cockpit was of any interest to me. We fired 2 missiles at the trailing guy. The first missile, the MiG was turning at about 5.5 to 6 Gs. What the missile saw was the top of the airplane. The missile hit him right behind the canopy, cut him in 2, and burned both ends. The second missile went through the fireball. At that point, we figured the other guy would blow out of the fight and leave and go home, because that's what they normally would do. He stayed, and now he was threatening our number 4 guy, Tommy Friesel. We came back into the fight. We're now 4,000 feet from this guy. A radar mile is 6,000 feet. The missile has to travel out in front of the airplane a certain time before it arms, otherwise it sees the F-4 that just fired it and it'll blow up into the airplane. So we're 4,000 feet from this MiG. We fire one missile. It's an aft missile. The first time I saw the missile was when it exited the wingtip area, headed for the MiG. The missile motor was still burning when it got to the MiG. It hit him right behind the canopy, cut him in 2, and burned both ends. At that point, the North Vietnamese would not commit 2 MiGs coming down from the north to help out, and 2 MiGs coming up from the south to help out. We found out later that these guys had flown every day for a month just to fight us. They were the aces. In other words, they had at least 5 kills. But we were going to make them aces. And if your training program doesn't measure up, it doesn't take long to figure out. That fight took 1 minute and 29 seconds. It was a supersonic or near supersonic fight in a box about maybe 1.5 miles wide, about 1 mile high. So a very hard turning, high speed fight.
And these were your first kills?
That was my second and third.
Second and third. And Chuck DeBellevue went on to become America's leading ace in the Vietnam War. So we have a real war hero here, honest to God. So talk to him afterwards. This is amazing. We're talking to real history here. But we're going to leave the F4 Phantom now.
Thanks, you're making me feel old.
That's okay, be embarrassed, that's all right. We're going to leave the F4 Phantom now and go to B-52s, a completely different aspect of the war. And again, we have this Hollywood image, Gregory Peck at 12 o'clock high in a B-17, and the Navigator sitting in the plexiglass bubble up in the front with the bombardier. What's the experience in a B-52?
Well, actually, when I was in it was a little more like Slim Pickens and Dr. Strangelove. But no, in actuality, actually there is some seriousness to that.
You didn't write a bomb down?
No,
Okay.
we didn't typically ride the bombs. But what the similarity is actually with that is Gregory Peck in the B-17, and if anyone's in the crowd here who has experience or knowledge of B-17, everything was around formation flying and mutual support with guns. The B-52 was designed as a strategic bomber, high altitude strategic bomber, part of our nuclear deterrent Trident policy, which the Trident being ground-based missiles, airborne bombers, and submarines with sea-launched ballistic missiles. Okay, so there's 3 parts to that. So the training mission of the B-52 was geared around lone penetrator, a single bomber, penetrating Soviet airspace and delivering their weapons on target. When we entered the Vietnam War, that's how all our SAC crews were trained. They initially had some issues wanting to put the B-52 into service. Number one, they were afraid of losing one. That was our number one strategic deterrent weapon system. Losing one would be considered looking bad for the United States. So that was one of the main reasons for committing B-52s. The other one was escalating the war because the B-52 was perceived as a nuclear strike weapon system. But whatever the decision was made to start implementing B-52s in operations, they had missions primarily against the South. And actually the first major attack didn't work out very well because they took these crews that were trained for single penetration missions and tried to put them into a formation, large formation, and put them against the target in South Vietnam. Subsequently, they had 2 B-52F models collide, but losing both aircraft. I believe they had 4 survivors out of the 12 crew members on that. And so as a result of that, they decided, well, B-52s really aren't like B-17s and aren't made to fly in large formations. They went primarily with 3 ships from that point on. Typical mission, they were flying out of Guam, Anderson Air Force Base. That would have been about a 12 or 13-hour mission. The crew would brief. They would prep the airplane depending on when they're striking the target. Remember, you're looking at striking the target about 6-7 hours from when you're launching. So you back off your launch time. You launch from the base, you launch in 3-ship formations, you hook up with a tanker because we're pushing the range of the B-52, refuel on the way to target, over target, deliver the bomb load, and then return back to base.
Now let's stop for just a second here. So for the crew, when you get over the target, what's the situation inside the aircraft? Again, the common image that all of us have, or most of us have, is this World War II image of the B-17s and the B-24s. What is it? What's going on inside the aircraft? What's the crew doing when you get over the target, or as you're approaching the target? And what image do they have of anything that's going on outside?
Okay, what the situation of the B-52 as opposed to the World War II class aircraft, primarily visibility outside the aircraft. The pilot and co-pilot obviously have forward visibility, very limited aft visibility, as in most of the World War II bombers. We had a tail gunner in the D model that had a window and a radar and a television camera in the aft end of the B-52. He actually sat in the tail. In the G and H models, I flew G's and H's, the gunner was moved up into the crew cabin and he only had a TV camera and a radar. The gun was still mounted in the tail. We had a quad 50 caliber gun in the rear. In the H model, we had the 20 millimeter Vulcan cannon, the same one that was on the E model that Chuck flew. And so we had the gunner. In the G model, he's not using visibility. You don't have a whole lot of crew calling out threats. You have an electronic warfare officer calling out threats based on returns from his electronic equipment. He's going to show returns. We had the fighter threat was there, but it was minimal due to quite often Chuck's unit and units like his doing the cap for the B-52 missions, and that's a cover for the B-52s, so that the fighters aren't a threat. The major threat for the B-52 was missiles, some AAA, but primarily the missile system. The SA-2 was a large threat, and that was discovered early on in the war as the first losses of B-52s came in. It was due to SA-2 missiles. The crew training once again in SAC, as you're looking at the 12 o'clock high, somewhat similar tactics were used initially. IP inbound, you're straight and level, you're flying to target. You hit that IP, it doesn't matter what's going on around you, what the threats are, they can be called out. You're flying to target, because, and the philosophy there was, we want the aircraft in optimal condition on the right track for bomb release, so we're hitting the target and there's no limited collateral damage. If you look at the B-52 that was primarily involved in Vietnam, the D model, that was modified. The initial B-52 carried 27 500 or 750 pound bombs internally. The G model could carry no bombs externally. It could carry missiles for the nuclear deterrent. The D model had pylons put on so it could carry 24 bombs externally, a dozen on each pylon. They took the D model and did what was called the big belly modification, where they modified it where it could carry 84 500-pound bombs internally, or 42 750-pound bombs. And we're talking, so a fully loaded B-52D model with the 500-pounders and 750s on the wing, that's 60,000 pounds of ordnance. That's a lot of iron be falling from the sky. You wanted to hit on the target. That was their philosophy. What they discovered doing that, losing aircraft, IP inbound, SAC discovered, okay, that this isn't really the optimal tactic to use. They then authorized the bombers to be able to maneuver. They figured the exact point where the bomber had to get on track and on course. They had to hold that during the bomb release. After bomb release, they did a standard turn. The bomber became very vulnerable to the SAM missile at that point. The D model had a more advanced electronic countermeasure system, and they used mutual support with the 3 aircraft Plus they were using the EB-66 in the area, and they were using Wild Weasel and SAM suppression to help mitigate the threats as the B-52s were striking the target. Primarily, all targets were in the south doing supporting ground operations. And once they developed this tactic of being able to maneuver, the losses went down. When linebacker, can I continue on with linebacker? Okay, linebacker. So now this is, just like to make one comment too about in 1968, the Tet Offensive, from January 1968 to January 31st, or March 31st, at Caisson, B-52s flew 2,705 missions against the area around Caisson. Typically, a B-52 would drop that load of 60,000 pounds about 1,500 to 2,000 yards from friendly forces. At Caisson, they got down within 200 yards, which is awful close for that much stuff going on. I've never talked to anyone who was at Caisson during that, but I'm sure it's something that they never forget. That's a lot of sorties. We were flying also at that point out of Utapao, Thailand. That changed tactics considerably, because that's only now a 3 or 3.5 hour mission. No refueling required. They can actually turn an airplane in a day, send it out, bring it back, load it up, fuel it up, send it out again. Whereas out of Guam, with a 13-hour mission, you're lucky to get that airplane off again the next day. Now when we go on into linebacker, they increased, they brought in, they're operating all the Ds, they went up to about 50 Ds out of Utapao. And then they were operating all the rest of the aircraft out of Guam and Kadena in Okinawa. And the sorties out of Kadena and Okinawa and Guam and Utapao and Guam, they'd fly just over 100 sorties a day in linebacker, going against now the North. Once again,
Date of linebacker.
oh, linebacker would have been, linebacker 1 was the spring of '72. That was actually very effective bringing North Vietnam to the table. They weren't serious, however. We actually, during the linebacker campaign, B-52 losses increased, of course, because we put more B-52s in service. And just to put it in perspective, we up until linebacker, we only lost a couple bombers in the war in the South. During linebacker, we started implementing the G model, which wasn't effective at ECM as the D model. During the Vietnam conflict, we lost a total of 31 B-52s. We lost 17 B-52s in combat. And
Out of how many in service? Roughly.
Roughly about 350 B-52s were in service at that time. And we had, well, actually, I'm sorry, it was close to 250 B-52s in service. And during linebacker, we had about 50% of the B-52 force in Vietnam. The other half was still playing the role of that strategic alert nuclear deterrent. When they pull the Gs, actually, if you look at the B-52G losses to the Ds, it's substantially increased over the D models, especially considering the number of sorties flown. So the D model was much more effective than the G. And I've had a number of friends of mine who were POWs in Vietnam, in Hanoi. And the stories I hear are amazing about the B-52 strikes. They knew in the Christmas of '72 was linebacker 2 campaign. Because as I mentioned, linebacker 1, Vietnam wasn't real serious. We stopped bombing. They negotiated to stop bombing. While we stopped bombing, they started stockpiling SAM missiles and resources. Because we were mining Haiphong Harbor, we were bombing areas around Haiphong and areas around Hanoi. And we were actually really taking it to North Vietnam at that point. As soon as we ceased B-52 operations, they started stockpiling again. So then they walked away from the table at that point. So in December, when we started hitting again, and these POWs started talking about this, they knew we were serious when the raids were hitting Hanoi, when they knew that their guards were hiding in holes in the ground with boards and metal barriers over them, just coming out to go to the bathroom, grab something to eat, and hop into the hole. And all our POWs are screaming out the windows, yelling and cheering on the B-52 forces. So they knew that at that point that was a major turn in the war effort in Vietnam, and that set the table for the negotiations for the United States making a withdrawal from Vietnam.
Okay, we've run a couple minutes over. Do you guys want to stay and answer a couple of questions, or go back to your tables and you can talk to them there? Anybody have a quick question from anybody?
If you're able to fly out of Thailand later in the war, why would you continue to also fly out of Okinawa and Guam? Is it because of space in Thailand?
Okay, if you're able to fly out of Thailand later in the war, why would you want to fly the more distant missions out of Guam?
Yes, you actually answered your question. It is because of space. The support structure for a B-52, the max they could support out of Utapao, Thailand was about 50 bombers. And so the number of resources we committed to the war effort, that allowed another 150 to 200 bombers out of Kadena and Guam.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much for coming, and come up and ask a private question.